As some of you know, the Achievement Gap Initiative is an effort to bring Harvard University's research resources to bear on the nation's Achievement Gap challenge. But we want to do it in a way that doesn't stay at Harvard University. We want to do it in a way that interacts with the world, that contributes to the problem-solving activities in schools and classrooms, so that a fair amount of what we do will end up being collaborative with schools and with practitioners and with policymakers over time. We are organized, as I explained last time, some of you may recall, into 5 research clusters that include attention to early childhood, the K-12 school years, state and local regimes, by which we mean how states and cities are organized to do this work. We're also paying some attention to measurement of achievement, and there's one other cluster that I'm blanking on right this minute. Which one am I forgetting?
Communities.
This one for today. College access and success. Right. There's a reason for that. So the structure of this initiative is that we've engaged faculty from across the university. This is a university-wide initiative. This is not located in only one school. And I'd also like to invite those of you who are in the audience who would like to have some affiliation or some relationship to what we do to be in touch with me later with regard to that. We're particularly interested in establishing relationships with schools and school districts that can become partners in some of the activities that we sponsor and organize. I wanted to start off with a poem that some of you have heard me read before. I read it here, I think, about 9 months ago, but I think it's about the kinds of students that we are concerned about, or at least some of the kinds of students that we're concerned about. Those that are in high school, we think they've got a shot at getting to college, but there's a stretch and there's a need for some support. The poem is called Hardships and Distractions, and it comes from a collection of poems that I do for teachers. This one was actually motivated by the lack of empathy that I saw among many of the high school teachers that we were working with who got impatient with students without understanding how complicated those students' lives were. I'm going to have my dinner at my grandma's house today. My mom is staying late for work to make some extra pay. I got a lot of homework, but I'm worried about my mom, so that makes it hard to concentrate. My mind feels like a bomb. I've also got to make sure that I wash some clothes to wear, and I got to get the stuff I need to tame my crazy hair. And while I'm doing that, I'll use the phone to make some calls to tell my friends about the time and place for Friday at the mall. And sometime between now and then, I got to get some dough, because I ain't going to the mall all destitute and po. I know I should focus on that test I've got in math. But my English paper's due soon, too. I need some help real bad. Some teachers think I just don't care. Some think I'm not trying. I think I'm caught in a trap. Sometimes I just start crying. But no one ever sees my tears because I just show the tough side. I like to seem real in control. If not book smart, then streetwise. I wish my teachers understood what it's like to be me, to see my life the way I do, the whole complexity. They'd see how hard it is to keep so many things in focus. They'd see how blurry things can get, how stuff can seem so hopeless. My teacher said I best be ready when I take that test in math. But I ain't got no help at home. I never knew my dad. I want to go to college, but for that I need good grades. And based on what my grades are now, there may not be a way. I don't know what I'm going to do. I need someone who's wise to help me figure out which way to turn, to empathize. But let me stop daydreaming, because I got a lot to do. If I don't start my homework soon, I never will get through. If I try and still can't do it, then I just won't hand it in. But if I don't try, I'll never know. So here goes. I'll begin. Every day I pray to find someone to guide me and to care. Is there any chance that you could be the answer to my prayer? So those of us in this room would like to be the answer to the prayers for kids like that. The Achievement Gap Initiative is aimed at bringing research-based knowledge to bear on being the answers to the prayers of students like this. And this evening is one of their first events where we're coming to you as a community and really becoming a community ourselves focused on these things. So let me introduce the 3 speakers for tonight, all of whom are Harvard faculty. First is Christopher Avery. Chris Avery is a professor of public policy at the Kennedy School of Government, someone I've had the pleasure of working with on several things over the last year and have gotten to know Chris and really appreciated that. Chris is actually a very highly regarded economic theorist, but he's not happy just to do economic theory. He's also an innovator in college access programming. Avery co-founded the COACH program with Tom Kane. The COACH stands for College Opportunity and Career Help Program. It pairs Harvard students with high school juniors and seniors. Harvard coaches meet weekly with lower-income students to assist them with various tasks associated with applying to college and obtaining a career post-high schools. Coaches provide personal assistance to many students would never otherwise receive. Chris teaches courses in economics and statistics at the Kennedy School and is a graduate of Harvard, Cambridge, and the Stanford Business School. Bridget Terry Long is Associate Professor of Education and Economics at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Bridget is trained as an economist. Her work applies the theory and methods of economics to examine various aspects of the market for higher education in the United States. Her research focuses on access and choice in higher education, the outcomes of students in college, and the behavior of post-secondary institutions. Of particular interest is the impact of government and institutional policies. Her current research projects include studies on the impact of financial aid policies, an evaluation of the effectiveness of post-secondary remediation, and an analysis of the role of class size and faculty characteristics on student outcomes. Bridget has a PhD and a master's degree from Harvard, both in economics, and she's the recipient of a number of awards, including dissertation fellowship and even special recognition in the press as promising upcoming academics. Finally, Vivian Louie is Assistant Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Vivian is a sociologist by training, and she studies immigration and education with a particular focus on second-generation immigrants. Her book, Compelled to Excel: Immigration, Education, and Opportunity Among Chinese Americans, examines the role of the immigrant family in the educational experiences of second-generation Chinese Americans and their incorporation into American life. Her present research extends the line of inquiry to explore the Dominican and Colombian cases, and this will allow for between-group comparisons with Chinese and intra-group comparisons among Latinos. She's particularly interested in how immigrant parents form aspirations for and invest in their children's education and careers, how children make sense of the parental influence and experience in schooling, and how children develop their identities with a focus on the effects of social class background, neighborhood, race, ethnicity, language, gender, transnationalism, and immigration in such processes. It's a mouthful. Previously, Vivian worked as a newspaper journalist and a lecturer in sociology at Harvard. And she received her bachelor's and master's degrees. Well, her bachelor's degrees from Harvard, her MA in communication from Stanford, and her PhD from Yale. And I think I'll stop with that and introduce you to our panel to get the evening started. Bridget is going to introduce the panel, and then will come Chris, then Bridget, and Vivian again.
Great. Can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you again for coming this afternoon. It is a lovely day outside, but we appreciate you being here, and hopefully we're going to kick off an interesting discussion. But before we get started, we thought as a group it would be important for us to highlight the racial gaps that we do see in terms of post-secondary outcomes. Starting right here, this is just looking at students who graduate high school on time by race. And if you can't make out the different bars, Asian is green, white is yellow, black is red, and Latino is kind of a turquoise blue. So you can see about 72% of African Americans graduate high school on time and about 67% of Latinos. When you then look, though, of those that are graduating from high school, how many are entering college the next year? You see that you're losing more students in the pipeline. You have less than 2/3 of black and Latino students that are entering high school, and you can compare that to white and Asian students. And then very striking, we don't only want to worry about college access, but also college success, what happens once students enter college. And in fact, looking at some longitudinal data, less than, or about 1 in 10 of Black and Latino students after entering college actually finish their degree on time. The numbers aren't much higher for other groups, but you definitely see the differences. For white students, it's about 26%, and for Asian students, about 31%. But still, again, I want to drive home the point. 1 in 10 Black and Latino students are completing college on time. So we certainly have significant gaps to be concerned about. And while K through 12 is definitely very important, just getting students to the high school degree is not enough. This table is just briefly showing why does this all matter in terms of post-secondary outcomes. And if you look at this horizontal line right here, these are the incomes over time for high school graduates, kind of normalizing those. And in comparison, what different groups have been making with some college, a bachelor's degree, and an advanced degree. And as you can see over time, the difference between those with just a high school degree and those with more of a college education has been growing over time. So as we go forward, we have to be concerned about getting students to that college degree, whether it's an associate, bachelor's, or an advanced degree. And of course, we know there are many other non-monetary benefits and public benefits to society by trying to address these gaps. So hopefully this gives you some background. And now, for the rest of the presentation, we're going to speak about some of the barriers to college access and success. Chris is going to talk about aspirations, expectations, motivation, and then also information, dealing with some of his work. I'm going to speak about the impact of financial aid and academic preparation. And then Vivian will spend the last section dealing with issues of immigration, race, ethnicity, and class.
We can just shift the microphone here. So Bridget's done a great job of just introducing this, what the problem is, what is the question, and what Bridget showed is there's an achievement gap in terms of enrollment and completion. So at every different level, there's an achievement gap. Now, Bridget highlighted this phenomenon for minorities. If we had broken the data separately by income or socioeconomic status, SES, we'd find basically the same kind of phenomena. So that's really the starting point. And I want to start by drawing a connection to what Micah Pollock and Prudence Carter really emphasized at last week's session. They said, and the point was, just because you see an achievement gap doesn't necessarily translate into a difference in values. So that's really my first point. The enrollment gap that you just saw does not represent any lack of interest among the students who are involved. The first two hypotheses you might start with are, if you're looking at the background information from Bridget, you might think, well, maybe minorities and folks from low SES backgrounds aren't so interested in college, and connected to that, maybe they don't actually understand that there's a premium in wages from trying to get an advanced degree. These were some of the things that were in our minds when we started the coach program, and we thought that these would be hypotheses that we'd investigate, and they were very connected to policy. If you find that those are the problems, then really information about college and some motivational work is what's going to help perhaps address these gaps. Well, we found out that that's not at all the case. The first thing is that the students from the low-income families, certainly the ones we work with in the Boston Public Schools, all recognize the value of a college degree. We asked them how much they thought they would make with and without a college degree. They're actually a little over-optimistic on both of them. When at age 25, they thought they'd be making close to twice as much with a college degree than without. It also turns out that they're not too good on estimating how much it's going to cost. They overestimate that as well. But even with all the figures that were provided, it was clear that just going on the numbers that were, the perceptions of the students themselves, they think that a college degree is a really valuable thing. And we did some work with suburban students, the same surveys. Suburban students in a really great school district, Concord, Carlisle, here in suburban Boston, had exactly the same views, both on tuition and on the value of a college degree. So there's really very little difference in perception of the value of college and interest in college, as you'll see in a moment, between suburban students and students from the Boston Public Schools. Second point, you don't really have to motivate students to think about education because they all already have high aspirations. More than 90% of the students that we see on the first day, actually our first day is October of the senior year, so it's already into the senior year, are telling us that they want to pursue further education the next year, and more than 70% of those students say they want to go to a four-year college. Coming back to the point about values, I think actually the dropout phenomenon that Bridget mentioned underscores, I think, the fact that there is a value to education that is common among students in city public schools. A lot of their classmates have dropped out already, and they've made it to the senior year. So that's already really a statement of some kind of interest. Whereas in wealthy suburban districts, I think the dropout rate is relatively low. Most everybody progresses grade by grade through the system. Making it to 12th grade isn't a statement of anything in those schools. Okay. Oh, so I need to go down. Down. Okay. There's a persistent finding, however, that there is an enrollment gap. So if the enrollment gap doesn't come from information about the value of college or from interest in college, it has to come from somewhere. But let me first just tell you that there is a persistent finding that there's a gap between what people say they're going to do and what people actually do. In a national survey, the National Educational Longitudinal Survey, the NELS, that gets used quite a bit, more than a third of the students who say that they're eventually going to complete a four-year degree haven't even enrolled in college a year and a half out of high school. Now, that's not necessarily inconsistent. You might plan to get a 4 degree and always have planned to do it stopping out for a couple of years before you go to college. Some people would even say that's healthy. But we know as cynics and pragmatists that a lot of people who say that they're going to go to complete a college degree but haven't enrolled after a year and a half to 2 years are never really going to make it there. Similarly, Gary Orfield, who's a professor here at the Ed School, who also is involved with a lot of this kind of work, and now through the Harvard Civil Rights Project, years ago he did a study in Indiana where he interviewed a lot of high school students, and he found there was a total mismatch between their aspirations and their preparation. Almost all of them said they were going to college, but among the high school seniors he interviewed, a high percentage of them really didn't have the academic preparation. They hadn't even taken the right courses. And so obviously there's going to be a problem somewhere. There's a conflict between what people say they're going to do and what they're actually prepared to do. And I'm going to show you on the next page that we find similar phenomena working with students through the COACH program. So there's actually a bunch of different explanations. As I mentioned, the Gary Orfield explanation is an obvious one, that students with poor academic preparation just aren't ready to go to college. And so it's not a problem of information or access or interest, but it's a problem first of planning with high student-to-counselor ratios in city public schools and perhaps limited social capital among their families and their peer networks. Students just haven't put themselves in position to go to college. This plays out a couple different ways when you actually get to the point of applying to college. I'll start with the second one. The second one is a bunch of students, and we see this all the time in our program, say, I want to go to such and such college, and that's the only one I want to go to. But when you look at their qualifications, they're not going to be admitted to that college. And in particular, there's a lot of students who say, I only want to go to a four-year college, when the obvious route for them might well be a two-year college. Anyone really can enroll in a two-year community college and move along track towards some kind of post-secondary degree. But students without the sufficient academic preparation aren't going to be able to do four-year college work right away. So many students are overambitious in the choice of where to apply, and that plays a big role if they're not going to eventually become more pragmatic and end up enrolling in a less selective four-year college or in a two-year college. The second thing that happens along the way is students get discouraged from applying at all if they get low SAT scores. And these two things are really quite bound up. If you have low SAT scores, you suddenly realize, well, I may not get into the college I want to go to, and perhaps that's sufficiently devastating that you never end up making it to any college at all. Second obvious point, financial constraints and difficulties with the FAFSA. Many of the students we work with who could qualify for a Pell Grant, which essentially makes community college for community college available for free, have trouble completing the federal financial aid forms, either because their parents are far-flung or uncooperative, and despite the fact that there are some outside agencies that will really help you complete a FAFSA, we see a number of students who don't make it through that process of applying for financial aid. Of course, financial constraints are even more binding for students who have to work to support families in various ways. There's a big debate in the literature right now. James Heckman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist at the University of Chicago, in analysis of some large data sets, has argued that there really is little evidence that financial constraints are contributing to this enrollment gap. But in practice, you certainly see lots of students who are in a position where it seems that that is a problem. And of course, there's an interesting phenomenon, which is the more that you're actually sophisticated about money, the less likely you're going to want to actually take on debt to go to college. And so it's the least sophisticated students who are going to blithely sign up to take on a huge amount of debt and probably run into a big wall later on. The last point, and this I'll emphasize the most here, is that we see through the process many students have problems just completing the applications, difficulty with paperwork and deadlines, and lots of students who are unable or unwilling to write a college essay. Some of these problems are going to be connected to poor academic preparation, and you may well say, well, someone who isn't able to write an essay for a college application really shouldn't be going to college. But so there's a fine line here between barriers that are actually created by the process and instances in which the process is telling students they're really not prepared. They need to be aiming a little bit lower. Through some work we've done, we've tracked the students, what happens to the students over the course of the academic year. Eventually we're going to do some control group work, but this is really just the treatment group. These are students that we worked with over the course of the year, what happened to them. Students, I remember I said 70% of the students we work with tell us they want to go to a four-year college. So this is just the students who wanted to go to a four-year college. And the phenomenon is that at each stage through the college application process, a few people are falling off track. To start with, 5% of the students that we work with don't graduate from high school right away. That's not too surprising. Another 60% don't have a GPA of at least 3.0. That proves that's not an absolute hurdle, but that's pretty much the standard for students to get admission to a public four-year college in Massachusetts at this point. So it's a kind of a good gradation. And actually about 20 to 25% of the students who don't have GPAs of at least 3.0 do end up going to in our program do end up going to a four-year college, but it's going to be many fewer of them than the students who have the higher GPAs. So already, the first two hurdles are knocking out a tremendous number of people from the four-year college path. And even among these students, well, and with an access program, the coach program working with them, well, 5 students never registered for the SATs out of 62. We started with 172. We're down to 57 who are on the standard path at the SAT registration. 8 of them never showed up, and that has to do with phenomena that they're getting assigned to there aren't that many test centers in the city. They're being assigned to places that are far away. They may have family obligations at the last moment. They're probably all scared about taking the test, too. So even if you work with the students beforehand and say, are you all set to go to the SAT tomorrow, a bunch of them never make it. 7 of those people never applied to a college, and another 5 who did apply to college actually never got in or just couldn't enroll for one reason or another. So we started off with 172 people who were interested in going to a four-year college, and only about 25% of them in the end, is gradually siphoning off, actually made it to a four-year college. Still, about 70% of the students in our program overall or more actually end up going to a college the following year, on track for that at the end of by high school graduation. But a lot of them are not going to four-year colleges. So much of what I should be saying tonight you should take in the context of going to a four-year college. Well, we compared these students, at least to the suburban school, Concord, Carlisle, that I mentioned to you before, and it's just a striking difference. At the start, there's not that much difference in perception of plans for the next future year, what it will cost you to go to college, what will be the result in terms of your effect on wages if you do go to college. But where only 25% of the people who we said who were planning to go to four-year colleges got there on the ordinary track with a 3.0 GPA and doing all the different stages, 96% of the students in Concord, Carlisle who said in October that they were going to go to a four-year college actually were doing that the next year. And that represents a lot of differences in academic preparation, in social capital, help from families, and orientation of the school. So one of the things, just to highlight one of many, that stood out was that every single one of these students had taken the SAT in their junior year of high school. Only about 30% of the students that we were working with, and we didn't have an 11th grade program at that time, had actually taken the SATs in the junior year. So already you can see you start to work with students in October of their senior year. It's still possible for them to make it through the whole process, but they're just starting much later than in a suburb where everybody's already taken the SAT, probably taken it a couple times, in fact. It's natural at this point to start thinking that there's a tremendous disadvantage, and I think that there is, to coming from a less wealthy neighborhood, a school with less wealthy students from less wealthy families, and fewer parents who've actually gone to college and understand the system. There is a flip side to this, and that is, while the suburban students are expecting and receiving much more help in applications, they're also under a lot more pressure. And it's a very different process for them than it is for the students in our program. One of our undergraduate coaches, Vinu Nadella, did a senior thesis where he did surveys and interviewed students both in a city school and in a suburban school. He found that they actually gave very similar responses to surveys. Who's helping you and how much are they helping you? But when he actually asked them in qualitative interviews more detailed questions, what he found is the students from the suburbs are getting incredibly more help. They'll rate the same, they expect more help, and so they say it's a 4 on the scale of 5 from the counselor, but a 4 on the scale of 5 in the suburb means a lot more than what it does in the city. And in fact, when it got to the point of parents, the parents are doing so much in the way of helping students on applications in the suburbs that some of them talked about our application. And Vinu said, well, what do you mean, our application? Aren't you the one who's applying? Well, no. The student says, actually, it's mostly my parents. And this leads into a broader question. So recently, Harvard and a number of related institutions are starting programs to try to target talented students from unusual backgrounds, unusual in terms of not being feeder high schools to the selective colleges. And so they're targeting outreach and they're targeting financial aid. Harvard has a program now that says under a certain income level, we're going to make sure that you can come to Harvard for free. So one of the things that lots of folks, researchers like me, end up doing is looking at some admissions data and trying to see if admissions outcomes are the same for people with different backgrounds. And so I did this in a study of early applicants, and what I found was people who apply early action or early decision with similar credentials to students who apply in the regular process are very much advantaged in the process. And you'll find the same kind of thing if you look for the effect of admissions on being an athlete, the effect of admissions on being an alumni child. Bill Bowen at the Mellon Foundation and some of his colleagues have done a lot of work like that. A question that you might ask, and someone asked me recently, a journalist asked me, should we consider affirmative action for students from lower income backgrounds in terms of essentially pretending that their SAT score is a little bit higher, or saying that if you have the same credentials as somebody from a suburban or a private school, we're going to be more inclined to admit you? Well, I said, I don't know what affirmative action means in this context, because you can't, it's not a level playing field. You cannot evaluate the application of a student from a low SES background in the same way that you evaluate the application of a student from Concord. And there's so many differences. Information among your peers and your parents, existence of advanced courses. A lot of these schools are designed to pump up your credentials. The suburban schools and private schools are designed to pump up your credentials so you look great for college admissions. They've got you thinking about that from the 7th grade on. They have students in the city probably have to work part-time. Students in the suburbs spend all their time thinking about what extracurricular activities are going to look good to admissions offices, and so on. You can pay lots of private counselors and take SAT prep courses. It'll turn your stomach once you start hearing figures about how much folks actually are doing this if they've got the money. So the summary is, aspirations and expectations really, I don't think, explain this particular achievement gap, a gap in enrollment. And then you have to ask the question, well, how much responsibility are we putting on individual students. What I've basically told you is students from low SES backgrounds don't have the peer groups, they don't have informed parents, they don't have the school culture that's going to drive them through the process to get to college. It's going to would put a lot of pressure on them along the way. So you can certainly say any student from these backgrounds could still do all these things. You could find resources at the Boston Public Library. You could go and ask your counselor. You could go to an after-school program or a boys' club or a girls' club and find someone who can help you with that. You can talk to the teacher and figure out what courses you really should be taking. All these things are possible, but that's a lot to ask. And so what we're seeing is, that's not happening in most instances. So I think that's a kind of an open question, which is how much responsibility are we going to try to ask to put on particular students and say, you need to overcome this. It's appropriate for us to expect that you can overcome whatever gap in resources you have that's now translating into a gap in enrollment. With all these factors coming together, to, I think, affect and explain the gap in enrollment, it's a problem for researchers and policymakers. We really would like to be able to disentangle one from the other and be able to say, well, of the hundreds of things you might try to do, we're obviously not going to be able to change underlying culture. We're not going to be able to overcome problems of poverty. We can't change around the schools ourselves in dramatic ways. Are there some interventions that we could attempt that would really make a difference? So in order to get at that, I think the most promising research approach is to start looking at factors one by one and try to isolate their effect, starting with financial aid, which Bridget is going to talk about now.
Thank you. Okay, I think Chris gave you a lot of food for thought. Like he said, I'm going to continue now and speak about the role of financial aid. I put up the summary chart here just so you can see that the government, federal and state government, are spending about $150 billion a year on financial aid. And so there are questions about, do these programs work? Which programs work better than others? If we want to go forward and address gaps in terms of resources, what kinds of programs would we like to have? Again, though, I'd like to emphasize what Chris was just saying. As we go forward in trying to research how to deal with these gaps, and I'm thinking in particular here about financial aid, we have to think about ways to isolate what is the impact of financial aid versus other types of interventions. This actually becomes a very complicated problem in dealing with research, and one of the reasons why oftentimes we don't have answers to a lot of the important questions. For example, if you're going to study a financial aid policy that was introduced, say, in 1972, there are a lot of other things going on in the 1970s that might actually explain any kind of response that you see. So you have to use some clever research designs to get around that. And also just the fact that, oftentimes if you're going to look at a need-based program, if you're going to look at a scholarship program that goes to low-income students, we know they're coming from backgrounds where they're getting fewer resources in high school, all the way actually from kindergarten on up, like Chris just talked about. And so they might have many risk factors that might impact their college access, their college performance, and so forth. So we have to figure out ways to separate the impact of all those other factors that might impact college access and success from financial aid. And so a big concern is our data. And I'm going to try to highlight some of the data sources that are out there. But one movement that's been happening amongst researchers who look at these issues are doing partnerships with schools, with universities, with states to try to get more information about what students are doing. So getting back to the question, does financial aid help increase access? What do we know? First, I want to, somehow this didn't come up like planned. First, let me talk just about grants. The Pell Grant is the foundational program. It's the largest grant program given by the federal government. It's a need-based grant. About 6 to 7 million students receive it every year at about $9 billion a year. And when it was first introduced in 1972, people did studies looking before the grant was introduced and after to try to see whether or not needy students who received the grant were more likely to go to college. Very early on, they weren't finding an effect, but if you look over time, use of the Pell Grant has grown tremendously, and actually it's a very popular form of aid with non-traditional older students. Actually, 90% of the students that receive the Pell Grant make under $30,000 a year. As researchers, as I'll show you in a second, we know that financial aid grants matter, but we wonder, are there ways that we might be able to change the Pell Grant to make it even more effective? Which is why I list the second program here, the Social Security Student Benefit Program, which existed until 1982. And basically what happened is if the federal government, if your parent was older, disabled, or deceased, you received money from the federal government. And some work by Susan Donarski, who's at the Kennedy School, found that when they took away this program, there was actually a huge enrollment effect. Now, why might that be the case? If you'll remember what Chris was saying earlier, in order to receive financial aid, you have to fill out something called the FAFSA, which most families consider to be a complicated form asking all kinds of information. You don't actually fill this out until the spring of your senior year of high school, and so you're not finding out if you're eligible for aid until later in your high school career, maybe too late to impact your decisions. Whereas the Social Security Student Benefit Program actually sent you a letter and said you were eligible for this money because your parent is already receiving Social Security benefits. Do you want this money or not? Yes or no, check the box. And so it was a much easier program. The information was much more dispersed. And so there isn't that much of a surprise that when they took it away, they did find a large impact on college enrollment. And so this, again, as we start to think about the Pell Grant and how we might reform it. There are also a number of state merit-based aid programs. You might have heard of things like the Georgia Hope or the Florida Bright Futures. There's been a growing desire for states to deal with things like brain drain, to have more skilled workers. And so actually over 20 states now have these programs. They're very popular politically. They get governors elected. Certainly it's worked well in places like Georgia. Again, Susan Donarski has done some work where in Georgia, if you get a B average in high school, you automatically get free in-state tuition, or you get a comparable stipend, about $3,500 at an in-state private institution. And this had about an 8 percentage point increase effect on enrollment. Again, a very simple policy for people to understand. Everyone in the high schools understood it, the teachers, the parents. If you ask a third grader in Georgia now, they understand this program. So again, wanting to emphasize the importance of information. I've also done some work looking at the Georgia Hope, trying to understand how colleges react to this policy, because we can't forget the supply side and all of this. But for lack of time, just to kind of summarize, what do we know about grants? There's been a lot of work that has found that grants, this is scholarships that you don't have to repay, have a positive impact on access. It does differ by income. And interestingly enough, though, sticker price, or the list price that you see in the back of the catalog for a college, has a much greater effect on people's decisions of whether to go to college and where to go to college than necessarily price minus financial aid. People like simple signals, and so by offering more financial aid, we're complicating the price process rather than just offering them a cheaper price. So again, I keep emphasizing the importance of information here. There's also questions about whether or not the importance of price has been declining over time. In earlier research I've done, if you look at the high school class of 1972, and you look at students that lived in more expensive states in terms of tuition costs versus less expensive states, it really does explain a lot about who's going to college versus who is not. When you look more recently at the high school class of 1992, you don't see those kinds of stark differences. And all of this is to say that price is definitely becoming a more complicated indicator, and I'm going to talk more in a second about academic preparation, that price alone isn't the only thing that matters. But certainly the design of policy matters, and so does information. Two major trends, though, that we're worried about as we think about gaps by income and race is the fact that the Pell Grant, which again is the kind of foundational aid program in the United States, has been declining over time. And so this is showing what percentage of tuition the Pell Grant covers at private four-year institutions and public four-year institutions from 1975 to 2000. As you can see, it's been declining. The second major trend is that students are taking on much more in loans than what they were getting in grants. And so the dotted blue line are actually grants, and then in the red line there are loans. And so what do we know about other forms of aid, things like loans? Well, yes, again, their use is increasing, and since 1992, any family's been eligible to receive a federal loan. Now, you still have to be a poor student in order for the interest to be subsidized, but you're still getting a loan at a pretty low rate. The research findings about whether or not they impact access and choice, in general, we do see that offering loans seems to impact access in terms of students going to college. We know less about how loans are impacting things like persistence. Another two major programs in terms of financial aid are tax credits. You may have heard of the higher education tax credits. Again, the federal government's been moving away from grants to loans, tax credits, and saving instruments like the 529s and education IRAs. Basically, these two programs that have just been introduced within the last 8 years tend to benefit middle and upper income families a great deal more. For example, the tax credits, first of all, you're eligible for a tax credit if you make up to $103,000. That's very different than the Pell Grant, remember, which 90% of recipients make less than $30,000. Also, there is a delay in receiving the benefit. So if you go to college and you have to pay your tuition up front, you're not going to get that refund or that credit until the following April. So for low-income families, first-generation families, families particularly that are going to be disproportionately of color, if you need money right away, this is not going to be the program that's going to help you. And also the same thing with saving instruments. When you look at who are actually able to use things like 529s and education IRAs to save for their children, they're going to be families from upper income groups. So these forms of aid, which is unfortunately the way that the government is going, are much more complicated to kind of understand, and they're often benefiting the groups that we're not really that concerned about. And so when you look over the last 30 years, what's been happening with financial aid, this is comparing the immediate transition from high school to college from 1972, 81, and 1996. And what you can see over time, in general, more people are going to college, but there still is a significant gap in terms of income between the bottom 20% versus the top 20%. And not only do you see this gap in whether or not people are going, but also where they're going. If you look at the bottom 25%, only 28% of them are going to a four-year college, whereas 66% of the top 25% were going to a four-year college. So even with 30 years of financial aid, the Pell Grant was introduced in 1972, we still have these huge gaps by income. And financial aid alone is not going to necessarily address all those issues. But there certainly are a number of things that we need to learn. First of all, the interactions between financial aid effectiveness, information, and policy design, as I was emphasizing before. Second, what's been the impact of the shift from grants to loans? Third, what's the role of the supply side? The fact that we have 6,000 colleges and universities that are interacting in this game, and they're offering their own financial aid, oftentimes merit-based aid, and maybe interacting in a way that's actually taking things away from students. And then finally, we haven't talked a great deal about persistence, but we don't actually know a great deal about how financial aid is affecting whether or not a student is making it to the college degree. We certainly have anecdotal evidence. We certainly know of a lot of stories, but we need much more research, not only on getting students into college, but persistence. So moving right along and to the role of academic preparation, as I said, price doesn't explain everything. Financial aid doesn't solve everything. We know preparation matters, and Chris has definitely alluded to a lot of those issues. We have a sense that certain benchmarks matter. There's been work done by Cliff Edelman saying that Algebra 2 is a benchmark. However, when you think about the transition from high school to college, what do we tell high school students that they need? We say that you need 4 years of math, 3 years of English, so on and so forth. We don't tell them particular competencies. And even things like No Child Left Behind or the MCAS, these are really minimum competency exams. They're not exams that are trying to prepare students to be ready for college-level material. I also find it interesting that high school teachers rarely interact with college professors at either way. And when we've been having lots of debates about No Child Left Behind and the MCAS, you oftentimes don't see anyone from the higher ed community at those discussions saying, this is what we really need in order to prepare students as they go on to higher education. So, not surprisingly, you find that about 35 to 40% of freshmen, when they enter, are placed into remediation. Basically, 80% of students are going to non-selective colleges where they may have taken the SAT, but the college admissions offices are not really instituting any kind of selectivity. So when they first get on campus, they take this remediation placement exam, and lo and behold, many of them are surprised when they are not ready for college-level material, and they were placed in these remedial courses. And there are lots of questions and debates right now in terms of policy about what to do with these underprepared students. In the late 1990s, CUNY went through actually a lot of controversy about moving all the remediation into the two-year schools. Here's a quote from Rudy Giuliani, who was mayor at the time. "CUNY University system currently devotes far too much money and effort to teaching skills that students should have learned in high school." So the sense that we've already paid for it once, we don't want to pay for it again in higher ed. And actually, in California, the CSU system in fall 2001 kicked out more than 2,200 students, nearly 7% of the freshman class, for failing to master basic English and math skills. So certainly, getting them just to high school isn't enough, and you can see the problems as they go into higher education. Now, I've done a great deal of work on this issue, working with the Ohio Board of Regents and data they've given me from their public system. And as you can see, just the students that are in remediation versus those that are not. First, African American students are more highly represented in the group that needs remediation. You can see the preparation levels are, of course, different. And then if you look after 5 years, you can see 57% of those that were placed in remediation are dropping out. No longer anywhere in the Ohio public higher education system. Unfortunately, though, the number is much higher for those that aren't in remediation. And in terms of completing a degree, only 12% of those that were placed in remediation in fall 1998 had a 4-year degree 5 years later. So preparation matters a great deal. So the question that I was asking is whether or not remediation works or not. Here are some basic facts, and I know I'm running out of time, but in general, students are placed into remediation based on placement tests, like I said before. 2/3 of the colleges restrict enrollment in other courses, so if you're placed in remedial math and remedial English, you aren't allowed to take other college-level courses at the same time. If you're getting things like the Pell Grant, other kinds of government aid, there's actually a clock on that, so you're using part of your financial aid clock dealing with high school level material. And there's actually a lot of variation across colleges as to what they consider to be remedial. And so for the study that I did with Eric Benger, who's at Case Western Reserve University, we used this variation to take two students that look very similar in terms of their preparation and background, two underprepared students. At one school, they actually are placed in remediation. At the other school, they are not. And we tracked both of them to see whether or not placing that student in remediation had a positive effect or not. And we do find the remediation works, that students who are in the remediation, who get those extra courses, get that extra support, are more likely to complete a degree, more likely to persist, less likely to transfer down to a community college or a less selective school. But again, overall, outcomes in higher education, as we start to get more data on graduation rates, persistence rates, and so forth, we see that many are not persisting, whether they're in remediation or not. And those in remediation, we see lots of discouragement in terms of major choice. So if you want to be an engineer and you get placed in remedial math, the likelihood of you being able to make that dream come true is quite low. So what do we need to learn? First of all, what competencies matter? Getting beyond saying 4 years English, 3 years math, and so on. Second, how can we best support underprepared students? So we have some early evidence that it looks like remediation works, but we need to find out more about what kinds of supports, what makes a remediation program work to really justify the cost, because as you can see, in a world of limited resources, people are trying to make important decisions. And then models of partnership between K through 12 and higher education. One example from Ohio is the Ohio State University math department realized they had so many people going to math remediation that the department chair decided to go into the area high schools and give the high school juniors the placement exam they would receive when they became college freshmen, to give them early information about what kinds of courses they would place into and what they needed to take if they wanted to avoid remediation. So we definitely need more partnerships like that. And then just in general, again, emphasizing the point, what other kinds of supports matter in college success? So as Ron alluded to before, I've been doing a bunch of work about what kinds of faculty supports, class size, a lot of the research that you see in K through 12 that we're now getting to doing in higher education. And with that, I will transition to Vivian.
Do you want this? Okay. What you see here is a slide that speaks to the growing diversity amongst college undergraduates in the United States. And what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes is talk about how including immigration, nativity status, would further complicate not only this slide, which shows results and projections, but also the processes that lead to those results and projections. So first, I'll show that immigrant newcomers and their children are an important population to consider as we think about achievement gaps in college access and success around race, ethnicity, and class. Then I'll conclude with thoughts for where researchers should go next. Now here you can see the basic demographic context. More than 60 million people in the United States, this is about 22% of the total population, are immigrants and the children of immigrants. The key to this demographic context is the Immigration Act of 1965, which reopened the doors to large-scale immigration to the United States. During the 1990s alone, more than 14 million immigrants entered the U.S., the largest number of any decade in American history. These flows of immigration are diverse across national origins, but they are disproportionately from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. What does this mean? It means that immigrant newcomers and their children are complicating our existing racial categories. White, black, and Asian, and Latinos are defined as being able to belong to any race. Now, what are the educational implications of this large-scale immigration? You can see here that children of immigrants are 1 in 5 children in the U.S., meaning between the ages of infancy and 18, and 1 in 4 low-income children. It's projected by the year 2015, children of immigrants will make up 30% of the nation's K-12 school population. So this is a sizable proportion of our school population, and it also is a sizable proportion of the low-income school population. Now, where are the children of immigrants living? About 95% of the children of immigrants are living in metropolitan areas, and this shouldn't be a surprise. This is something you probably would expect. Another thing that you might expect is that immigrants continue to settle in what we call destination states, right? California, New York, Texas, Florida, Illinois, and New Jersey. Now, what you might not expect, and this is important, is that the 1990s saw the rise of immigrants settling in bands of states in the Rocky Mountain, Midwest, and southeastern areas of the United States. These are places with little history of or existing infrastructure, including educational infrastructure for immigrant newcomers. So the story about how the immigrant newcomers and their children are going to be incorporated into those areas remains to be written. Another key thing to note is documentation status. It's estimated that there are 1.1 million undocumented children who are school age, between the ages of 5 to 19. Now, I don't really have time to discuss this topic at depth, but what I do want to say is that if you don't have papers demonstrating that you are here in the U.S. legally, you do not qualify for financial aid, you do not qualify for in-state tuition, regardless of whether you are prepared academically or not. And in terms of policy, one of the measures that's up before Congress this year is the DREAM Act, which attempts to address this issue. Now, what are the stakes and challenges for the children of immigrants then? As Bridget illustrated for us very nicely, higher education is key to succeeding in the restructured American economy. The stakes are especially high for immigrant children whose parents work in low-wage and low-skill jobs. You know, these children have to make a rather dramatic leap up the educational ladder over the course of one generation, and yet they're the ones who have the fewest family socioeconomic resources to do so. Another important issue is language. Immigrant children often have parents who are not proficient in English, and the children themselves face learning in another language. It's estimated that there are 2.6 million limited English proficient, or LEP, students in grades K through 12, most of them children of immigrants. And this is not an exclusively foreign-born issue. About 16% of U.S.-born children of immigrants are LEP students. And I do want to say, of course, that my colleagues here, Catherine Snow and Noni Lasso, who's here, I think, has shed a great deal of light on matters pertaining to bilingualism and language and literacy amongst young children from language minority backgrounds. One additional point with regards to language that is important, this is not exclusively an elementary school phenomenon. In fact, immigrant children make up a larger share of the secondary versus elementary school population. It's actually 6.4% at the secondary level versus 3.8% in the elementary level. And this is important because secondary schools are typically less equipped to teach content, to teach language and literacy as compared to elementary schools. So what do we know about immigrant students and the pipeline to college? And Chris has laid out the role of individual aspirations and institutional as well as family supports in the college pipeline. What I'm going to talk about is the role of parental aspirations for children's schooling and parental practices among immigrant families. Now, in the general educational literature, as some of you or all of you probably know, we know that both of these things make a big difference. In terms of aspirations, researchers have found evidence of what we call immigrant optimism. What this basically means is that immigrant parents have higher educational aspirations for their children than do native-born parents. And in a lot of ways, this is born of the decision to migrate, to leave one nation for another. Researchers have also found variability in how immigrant children actually do, right? Some fare really, really well, and others are failing or struggling. Researchers, myself included, are still trying to work through why this is the case and how much of the variability has to do with race, socioeconomic status, neighborhood context, and teacher expectations, and if so, the ways in which these things matter. That said, there exist conceptions of what I've called immigrant strivers, right? You can hear this term actually in the popular media, and you can see it in some of the scholarly research. And what this means is that immigrant strivers are supposed to be doing better as compared to African Americans and Puerto Ricans, mainly from a cultural perspective, it's argued, right? They have the right stuff. They want to do well. At the other point, though, we know that amongst all these immigrant strivers, some are doing better than others, right? So there's been an Asian versus Latino counterpoint that's been framed, with Asians being kind of the high achievers and Latinos being the low achievers. Of course, it's important to note that Asians and Latinos as labels incorporate individuals from extremely diverse national origins, phenotypes, class backgrounds, a lot of different things. Now, what I do, and what I'm going to talk about, is the second generation and then transition to college. And I define the second generation as the U.S.-born children of immigrants who make up 3 out of every 4 children of immigrants today. I also define this to include foreign-born children who came to the United States at very young ages. And what this is basically here is a snapshot of 3 projects of mine that have focused on how the second generation learn about the U.S. educational system. And I use in-depth interviews, demographic surveys, and descriptive census data. And today I will say that I will talk about Projects 1 and Projects 2. Now, last week, if you attended the Achievement Gap panel that kind of kicked us off, my colleague Micah Pollack gave a really wonderful talk. And she called upon us to avoid what she termed isolated analysis. And I really would agree with that assessment. And you can see that a common theme in my work is the comparative frame. I think that's important. All right. What I should say here is that you're going to get fewer slides and more of me. So just to prepare you, right? Going to go in old school here. But if you look at the left-hand side, you can see this is kind of some basic findings about my work with second-gen Chinese Americans. This is a Chinese study. It's the basis of my recent book, Compelled to Excel. I focused on college students who came from 2 very different Chinese immigrant worlds in the United States today. One, the urban enclaves of New York City, think Chinatown, where residents are typically do not have high levels of education and they work in low-skill and low-wage jobs. The other kind of world of Chinese immigrant America are folks who are incorporated into predominantly white upscale suburbs, and they're highly educated, highly professionalized. So what did I find? I found that across class and neighborhood context, Chinese immigrant parents, yes, they share high educational aspirations for their children. College is the baseline. And these aspirations are indeed grounded in immigrant optimism, right? These parents across class and neighborhood really believe that their kids have better educational opportunities in the United States and that there's a high payoff to higher education in the U.S. labor market. But these aspirations are not grounded in immigrant optimism alone. They're also grounded in what I call immigrant pessimism about children's possible futures in the existing American racial hierarchy, which the parents see as marginalizing those Chinese without higher education. The other point I want to make is that despite the shared aspirations, parental practices were not the same, and here class really matters. Working class parents confronted structural advantages to translating their aspirations into reality. And to compensate for these disadvantages, such as poor quality urban schools, for example, they drew on ethnic networks to learn about New York City's public school system, most notably exam high schools. But the experiences of these parents are not monolithic, right? There were differences. Some of the parents are able to use their resources to send their kids to academic preparatory schools, cram schools. But the key difference is that these parents lack the financial resources, they lack the English language skills, they lack the educational background, and they lack the time that middle-class professionals living in the suburbs, as Chris kind of explicated for us, could offer their children, right? Middle-class suburban immigrant parents here choose from a much wider range of high-quality schooling options. They invest in private lessons. They assume a much more active role in their children's schooling on a daily basis. It is very much the case of our college applications. On the right-hand side, you can see some basic points from the study on second-generation Dominicans and Chinese. And here I focus on the different kinds of information transmitted through ethnic networks and the different ways in which they are deployed. Now, the second-generation Chinese and Dominicans I interviewed came from families with low levels of human capital, but they successfully navigated the K-12 system to get to college. I was interested in how that happened. And as you can see, across ethnicity, my respondents reported high parental aspirations for their education, but low levels of parental involvement in their schooling. And in fact, there were distinct ethnic class strategies used by immigrant parents to sponsor their children's education. This distinction is evident in their answers to my question about what's the best high school, your parents wanted for you. And the answer for the Dominican respondents was Catholic school, right off the bat. They called it private school, but they mean Catholic school. For the Chinese, it's the public exam high schools. Short of this ideal, both Dominican and the Chinese are left with the neighborhood public schools. That said, my Chinese respondents used information passed on through ethnic networks to search out better performing options. In part, this is due to their financial capability to buy homes in working class neighborhoods in New York City, it is true, but working class neighborhoods with the better schools. For those families who cannot move out of Chinatown, the information from ethnic networks allows them to avoid the low-performing neighborhood high school, which in some cases was literally right across the street, which my respondents shunned, right? They used the information to go to better-performing high schools about a mile or 2 miles uptown. In contrast, the Dominican parents who could not afford Catholic schools for their kids, they often lacked information about the public school hierarchy in the area where they lived, and so they chose to send their kids to the neighborhood schools, right? It's the most convenient thing. They can walk right there. Unfortunately, because of where they live, these schools are low performing. I just want to say a few things about college. Across ethnicity, the role of immigrant parents in the college application process was minimal. In the Chinese case, the parents often know about Ivy League colleges. They certainly knew about Harvard and Yale and Columbia, right down the line, and other national Tier 1 research universities. And they gained this information through ethnic networks again, but they could not really advise their kids about how to get in. Students from both immigrant groups talked about choosing which colleges to apply to based on convenience to their home, hearsay, or just what looked good in the brochures. And I think everyone in this room would agree that those are probably not the best ways to go about it. For some of the Dominican respondents, however, information from teachers, counselors, and bridge programs, similar to Coach, was key to them learning about how to apply to college. Not just the procedural aspects, not just the deadlines, but the courses they needed to take, the SATs, college information, college trips, study skills, and financial aid. These are all the things that Chris talked about. Okay. I want to conclude with some discussion of my thoughts for future work. And here I'm drawing from an essay I'm writing for the Social Science Research Council's Transitions to College Committee. My charge was to identify what we know and where we need to go through synthesizing discipline-based reviews of the relevant literatures. And Bridget actually wrote a very fine essay on economics, which was joined by reviews of human development, sociology, education, anthropology, etc. So the first thing I want to say is that we need to pay more attention to variation along the lines of race, ethnicity, immigrant status, gender, and age across domains. This was a clear theme that emerged across these very different disciplinary reviews. And the continuing large-scale immigration to the United States intersects with these dimensions in complex and, to date, little understood ways. The second thing that I want to say is we need to adopt a life course approach. Typically, we think of the college pipeline as corresponding to 2 years of high school, the 11th and 12th grades, right? These are the years when people are beginning to prepare to apply. This is a rather compressed time perspective that effectively rules out the students who've already fallen out of the pipeline, right? Because they've become disengaged with schooling. So from the perspective of human development, we need to pay attention to the life course starting from early childhood onward, right? Because we know that early childhood education, for example, has great effect for children from low-income families. The stakes are high because some researchers have argued that the process of transmitting necessary information about college to students and their families should start as early as the 6th grade. There are also changing age demographics. Bridget alluded to this a little while ago about whom is going to college. No longer is the typical college student someone aged 18 to 22. 1/4 of our nation's undergraduates are aged 30 and older, and this is likely to continue. That means the sequencing of the high school to college transition is no longer disconnected from marriage, parenthood, and employment, as has traditionally been the case in the United States. Today, a significant percentage of our college students have to negotiate parts, if not all, of their post-secondary schooling alongside marriage or cohabitation, employment, children. Colleges that do not address issues of childcare, family housing, and flexible class hours can create unintended barriers to completion. Overall, it's crucial to consider the role of age, timing, and the life cycle, and who gets to pursue and who gets to complete post-secondary education. Third, and I am almost done, we need to integrate research, policy, and practice between K-12 schooling and higher education into a K-16 perspective. This would give, as Bridget alluded to, K-12 schools a better understanding of what students need to be prepared for college, and colleges a clear picture of the particular skill sets with which their students are arriving. And this integration could occur at various levels, right? State policies that encourage linkages between K-12 schools and post-secondary institutions, formal partnerships between K-12 schools and universities, collaborations between higher ed researchers and non-government and non-university research organizations that channel this information out to the public. The final thing that I want to say is that we as researchers need to adopt an interdisciplinary K-16 perspective. You know, we tend to stay bounded to one piece of the transition to college, and we tend to view research questions from the particular discipline that we've been trained in. And this is an approach that does not necessarily give us the most explanatory power for the kinds of questions that we're interested in answering. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Any of the panelists like any follow-up comments before we turn it over to questions? Okay. The floor is open for questions. I'm going to stay out of the way and let you call on people as they come up. Yes.
You mentioned college. You mentioned the inadequacy of saying students need 4 years of math as a way of describing minimum competency. Does that imply we need greater standardization of curriculum or assessment, or are you thinking of other solutions to that?
When I was mentioning things like the fact that telling people 4 years of math is not enough, I meant more specifics in terms of you need to get to pre-calculus or trigonometry, particular kinds of math, or if we're discussing English, certain skills that you can do in terms of critical thinking, critical reasoning, getting to a certain level, being able to write an essay, kinds of competencies that are required for college. I'm not going to get into the whole debate about whether one size fits all or one size can cure all. And actually, I would lean towards against that. I think there are multiple ways to get to the finish line, depending on student needs, the local area, how the student learns, all of those types of things. But in terms of competencies, I meant more specifics about skills rather than just time spent in a classroom.
And a natural thing to do would be to have a closer link in between the requirements for admissions to state colleges and the offerings and requirements for graduation from high school. That's the kind of thing you hear we hear all the time from talking to people in Massachusetts in public college admissions offices. They say there's all these schools that are graduating students that have met all the requirements for the school, and we can't even consider them for admission here.
The mic is open.
This is a question for Vivian and Bridget. I like your push to capture immigrant status and different variations of immigrant status, but most databases, the best they have is whether you were born in the U.S. and your parents weren't, or up to second generation. I was wondering what ideas you had to push national databases and other databases that we use to make these conclusions for policy on how to capture better definitions of immigrant status, generational status, and so forth.
I think, doesn't the new ELS, the data set that came out, it has a generational status measure, doesn't it? That's my understanding. That you can capture first generation and second generation. First generation meaning that typically that you migrated as an adult, and second generation meaning U.S. born, and some folks also include foreign born who come over at young ages like myself.
And the census captures part of it, but even going further, for example, the social capital of parents from other countries, how do you capture that in a database?
Right. I mean, I think that you raise a really important question, because the whole issue of social capital, how we measure class, and how that relates to social capital. For migrants, the big thing is that you have to have the pre-migration lens as well as the post-migration, because for certain immigrants, they could have been highly educated in their country of origin, but those skills do not transfer over for whatever reason. One of them could be language, another could be documentation status, into the United States, and therefore they're working low-wage, low-skilled jobs that do not necessarily reflect their original status, and then therefore they might have a middle-class orientation, some folks would argue.
So to back up what Vivian's saying, the national data sets where they're taking a sample of 8 to 10,000 students and following them, they have started to ask those questions about generational status, particular ethnicity, when your parents came over, what country they came from. But if you're only looking at, say, 10,000 students and you start to get within the group of Latino students by ethnicity or within the group of Asian students, you end up with very small sample sizes. And definitely with the pushback in 2000 for the census about how do we want to measure race or categorize race, things have gotten very complicated. I think that this is one area of research, as with many areas, where the qualitative and the quantitative are going to have to complement each other. There are certain things we can get out of these large-scale kind of quantitative studies, but to get at the fine detail of the kind of work that Vivian does, where you're actually talking to the family about what happened, what is your actual orientation, what did your parents do before they came here, those kinds of issues, I think we're going to have to inform each other.
One quick comment. There is actually one data set, and I think there will be more and more of them, that can be used for this kind of work. It collected by two sociologists, Portis and Rumbo. That's a very good data set. It's certainly only a start, but that is one data set, and so there are going to be these possibilities going forward.
Right, and that data set is in San Diego and in Miami. Right.
There's a mic on the stand in the middle of the floor.
It means we have to get up, though. Just a question and a comment. One is, if in your work you can define if there's a tipping point, if you will, at which you really begin to see a dramatic change in the number of students being prepared for and being able to go to college. If you see a tipping point in middle school or the third grade, or like at what point? And the second is a comment. I chair one of the schools committees for Harvard in New York City, and this year, as you know, there was a dramatic increase in the number of applications, and I have done minority recruitment for Harvard for a very long time, and I've got to tell you, this was an incredibly depressing process. And I wonder how meaningful an announcement of this type and an investment of this type is when almost without fail every student I saw from a non-traditional feeder school to Harvard was, a hopeless applicant. Kids who their academic preparation, the scores on the SATs, et cetera. I mean, it really made many of us who had all the best intentions of the world sort of actually depressed about how meaningful or significant, this big, expensive effort really is.
Well, I can say, I think that the answer to both the response to your comment and the answer to your question sort of has to be kind of the same thing. I think Harvard, not being part of the admissions office, I'll just sort of speculate a little bit. I think that there's two goals to this initiative. One is to try to encourage students who are qualified, who don't know somehow or aren't applying to Harvard, to get them to apply to Harvard and bring them in right now. But I think there's a larger scale goal, which is to try to provide some motivation for students who are in the 9th, 10th, and 11th grade over time to have a sense that this is something they can aim for, have their counselors have a sense this is something they can aim for a little bit of a learning process, so the counselors will see that this year's students didn't have it. But maybe in the future, students can, if they plan a little bit earlier, can aim higher and hopefully will be more prepared and will be stronger applicants in a few years. Now, that's purely speculative as to whether or not that's going to happen, but I think that it's clear that in addition to addressing the access problem, we have to, helping students who are qualified make sure to get to where they deserve to go. We really desperately have to address the pipeline problem, which is producing more qualified students along the way. It's got to be a combination of these two things. I don't think that we'll ever find a particular tipping point, because there's so many factors that create problems in 7th grade, 9th grade, and different factors in later years. But I do think that we do have to address the pipeline problem in one way or another. For Harvard as an institution to do that, this is their best hope.
I mean, it's also my hope that as Harvard gets more information about students out there who would like to come, but their preparation is not up to par, that we will, continue our efforts, not just with money, but with trying to reach back to communities. I think there's also a very symbolic thing with this movement. Chris brought up earlier questions about should there be affirmative action by income. Harvard's actually not the first institution to do something like this. When Princeton did it several years ago, it sent shockwaves throughout higher education. My hope is that by Harvard doing this, it's going to continue for other universities to do similar things and for us to start having more discussion about this. And like I said during my part of the presentation, it's going to take more than just money.
I think that the question you raised also, one of the debates that I was alluding to about the immigrant strivers and the differences therein, you do need something other than Harvard, first of all. And you do need more than just the ethnic community, because some folks have argued, well, you pick up a newspaper, you'll see it, right? You listen to the radio, you hear it. Oh, well, those Chinese and Koreans, they do it. right? I mean, they come from these kind of working class communities, and somehow their communities support and sponsor their kids' education. But, Latino, Mexicans don't do it, or, Guatemalans don't choose your group, don't do it. And their community, it must mean that their communities don't value education. And what scholars have kind of found in their work is that actually a lot has to do with context of reception in the United States, and the infrastructure of these ethnic communities. There's a big difference between a very differentiated, class-differentiated ethnic community that can have supports for businesses and that sponsor education, and ethnic communities that don't have that kind of financial capital. And those differences do exist.
I do have a question, but I just want to provide a little bit of context first. Parents and high schools do look towards colleges in terms of what colleges considers as sort of parameters or standards in terms of access. For instance, we want kids who are civic-minded, students who are mature, academically prepared, and the challenge arises when we put up these goals. We also prescribe what is the sort of one right way to demonstrate that. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about civic mindedness, we tend to talk about extracurricular curriculums and so forth. And maturity, we talk about things that, again, different ways that typical middle class parents and students can demonstrate that. And then when you talk about immigrant families, you also note how challenging it is for them to sort of conform to this way of demonstrating these goals that colleges value. So could the problem access, could part of that problem be how we perceive not only the goal, but how we assess that goal in terms of how families can demonstrate these things that we value? And what I mean by that is that, for instance, if you look at immigrant families, there are different ways they can demonstrate civic responsibility and maturity by being involved in helping their families survive, for instance, in terms of things that they do. And we note those things, but could those, how we perceive and evaluate that in terms of an admissions perspective, be a barrier to their own access to a higher ed?
Let me kind of just sketch out, as a college, let's say that you're getting 10,000 applications, and you don't want to just do it by numbers, what your SAT score was and GPA, so you're trying to do some kind of comprehensive review. And you actually have a very short amount of time to be able to go through all these folders and make decisions. You have at most maybe 3 months. So you're trying to pick some kind of information that you can easily comprehend and compare across groups. And so certainly scores are part of that, but people kind of understand extracurriculars and they understand being involved in the community, and they're looking for pieces of data that they can kind of very quickly look at a folder of a student and try to make a decision about 10,000 students over the course of 3 months. So questions about how could we judge things like maturity and responsibility, like you're saying, and teach admissions officers how to do that. What kinds of, it's really a question about what kinds of signals would we see? And in fact, you may actually see it coming out in the opposite. If you know a student is supporting their family, bringing money home, really the foundation of their family, an admissions officer could look at that and say, I'm going to be really worried that in the middle of their freshman year, this student's parent is going to have a crisis that they're going to have to deal with and drop out of school. So in some ways, you could actually see it backfiring, that if the college knows that the student is so instrumental within their family and that things do happen, that they may not be able to focus on their studies 100%, that could actually work against them. So it's not only hard to measure, but in some instances, depending on the admissions officer, depending on their experience with students in the past, may actually have it count against them. That's a concern that I would have.
My answer kind of focuses in more on the interactions between families and schools around kids or adolescents in the college pipeline. I think that you raise a very important issue, one that speaks to a lot of different dimensions. Immigrant status definitely being one of them, where language might be an issue, and culture, right? Immigrant parents coming from a different culture where the ways that they view teachers might be very different than the way teachers are viewed here, right? All the indicators of parental involvement, going to PTA meetings, really taking ownership of your kid's education, that can be alien in some of the cultures, class cultures that immigrants are coming from. But we also know that this speaks to issues to folks who are native born here and have been here for several generations of different racial and ethnic groups as well. A lot more collaboration needs to be done about views on schooling between families and schools.
People are starting to stand up and ask questions now. We started about 10 minutes late, so we'll run about 10 minutes late, and then Alex can stay on afterward to ask questions. We've got about another 7 minutes or so.
I just want to take 30 seconds to tell a joke, which I think I'm quoting somebody else. It stayed with me. This is from Nick Lemon, who is a wonderful journalist who's best known for writing The Big Test, which is a history of the SAT and how it's become so important. And in a discussion on exactly this topic last summer, he made the following point, which I think underscores how important parents are, and underscores the fact that certain people are just going to manufacture themselves in particular ways for college admissions. And he said what he said was, if Harvard and Yale and a bunch of other schools right now adopted gospel singing as a critical component of a college application, next year you're going to see a big difference in the set of people that they're going to admit from, and a lot of people from the fancy private schools are not going to be admitted. 5 years from now, if they keep doing it, the kids from the fancy private schools are going to get admitted just the same as they were before.
This question is for Chris, largely because I've discussed it ad infinitum with either of my professors on both sides of him. My question is regarding your discussion of affirmative action on the basis of socioeconomic status. And I'm from California, so I'm kind of very interested in the byproducts of Proposition 209 and the ban on racial preferences that took place there in 1996. And a lot of people allege that in the wake of that ban, that a lot of admissions officers from both the Berkeley and UCLA campuses, which are the two most selective schools there, kind of sought other ways around the ban by looking for proxies for race, by kind of utilizing outreach programs and kind of reaching out to underrepresented high schools. And I think in the process, what ended up happening, there have been a few articles in the Wall Street Journal by Dan Golden and Jay Matthews in the Post on this. And there's been kind of a discussion about the fact that people who attend very, very competitive high schools, some of the high schools that I think you profiled in your Revealed Preferences survey in California, which are disproportionately Asian American and white, are actually losing out in this process because this emphasis that's being placed on kind of reaching out to underrepresented high schools has resulted in kind of a disproportionate number of these students being rejected from these kind of high-pressure, highly competitive high schools. So I'm curious about your perspective on this and kind of the repercussions that you feel this might have for the development of these highly competitive high schools at which there may be substantial peer effects for students who enroll at these schools.
Okay, I really only have, I'll make one comment, and I'm not sure it's going to be completely on point, but that my colleague Tom Kane has done a lot of research in this area, and I think the big point to highlight is that anytime you try to proxy for race or socioeconomic status with things that are not directly measuring that, you're going to pick up a lot of people who don't actually fall into that category because everything else is so poorly correlated with those things. So I know that the broad findings that I know about, you probably know, it sounds like you know them much better than I do, are that we haven't really recreated the same composition of the class in terms of race, socioeconomic status in California that we had beforehand. So I think naturally you're going to see two things that happen. One is some of the people who actually fell into those categories, minority, low SES, whatever, are going to lose out because we're not picking them up as directly as we used to. But we're also doing something that's a little bit fuzzy and trying to pick them up. And so naturally, as you point out, as a byproduct of that is that people from the most competitive high schools are going to be losing out too because we're pulling in other folks to replace them. Coming back to the Nicholas Lemon point, people from competitive high schools are really good at making up gaps. if you go back 30 or 40 years, of course, they have, it used to be an entirely old boy network at the selective colleges, and so that has gradually been eroded away. But we have a long way to go before we're going to have to start thinking of those people as disadvantaged in any way.
Okay, real quick. I think you were all talking about interdisciplinary and qualitative collaboration. It seems like last week and this week, the one key message is that we need to zoom in and sort of zoom in on these phenomena. I think all of you brought that to light. I mean, to see who actually, we tend to talk very simplistically in education about these things with very big sort of big scale statements. And to really unpack the problem, it seems like we need to zoom in. Who actually made it to the SAT that day? But I wanted to ask, because it seems like, not so much Vivian, but Chris and Bridget, that I can imagine your message being taken in a very simplistic way as actually it's income that matters more than race. I think in the achievement gap debate, that's always sort of, is it class or race, is a simplistic way we always end up sort of framing this. But I can imagine journalists running with exactly that with both of your information. So I'm wondering how you respond to that when people inevitably ask you, isn't this really about income?
So there is a set of research where people have looked at, upper income African Americans or middle income African Americans, and do they have the same patterns as middle or upper income white Americans? And you see differences. Surprisingly, some of them are positive, and a lot of them are negative, where you see that income doesn't solve all the problems. That there are, whether it be social capital, whether it be long-term assets, whether it be parents, who maybe they're not maybe the student's not going to be first generation, but their parent didn't go to Harvard for the last 5 generations. So you're still, even when you take away the income, when you're not looking at poor people of color, you still see these gaps that are very troubling. When you look inside of schools, suburban schools, and Ron's done some work on this, and this is, something that I have seen, something that's very interesting from No Child Left Behind, are when these really top high schools that we've always thought of as being fantastic, when they have to break down by subgroup, these students that might have very similar backgrounds as their classmates aren't performing as well. So it's not just income.
I was curious to know your thoughts on current alternatives for schools that attempt to provide a high-quality education for students of color. For example, Boston charter schools, pilot schools, have seen some success with integrating disciplines and doing project and portfolio-based assessments in engaging and teaching students depth of content, yet then they graduate and go on to college and face lectures and multiple choice tests and do not perform as well. Do you think these schools are doing a disservice to their students who attend college, or is there a role for this alternative pedagogy in providing a high-quality education and an alternative to low-performing neighborhood schools for students of color?
I think that the charter schools that I know in Boston actually take a wide variety of different approaches, from some of the alternatives you've mentioned to the other extreme where they're giving massive doses of tutoring, math and English, some at the middle school level, some at the high school level. I think that we should think broadly of the charter school movement as a little bit of an experiment. Now, unfortunately, that means that the people who are involved right now are haphazardly advantaged or disadvantaged as, sort of experimental subjects. But I think that again, 5 or 10 years from now, we should be hoping that we found some really great lessons. Some of the charter schools are making great connections with colleges in order to try to overcome the problems that you just mentioned. But 5 or 10 years from now, we should be looking for the charter schools to be doing substantially better than they are doing now, putting together a lot of lessons about what's been working. And we're really hoping that those lessons are going to trickle back into the public schools, too.
I would like to thank all of you for coming out tonight and ask you to stay in touch with our work over the coming years as we pursue the issues that have been raised tonight. Thanks again.